Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The dark matter storm had arrived quietly, like a secret too large to be kept. For months, Earth's finest minds had worked tirelessly on something previously thought impossible, controlling dark matter, the invisible force that held the universe together. And no one knew the project's potential better than Dr. Jack McGregor. Jack stood in front of the massive glass window of the space station, watching the planet beneath him as it slowly turned. The Earth looked peaceful, but Jack knew better. On the surface, political tensions brewed, and above, somewhere deep in the reaches of space, they were being watched. Aliens, an empire of beings more advanced than humanity had ever known, had finally taken notice. Jack had spent sleepless nights anticipating this moment. His reflection in the glass, gaunt and serious, seemed as distant as the world beneath him. The message had come just hours ago. The aliens were coming. They had been monitoring humanity's progress, and now, they saw Earth's new discovery, dark matter technology, as a threat. The door to the observation room slid open behind him, and a deep voice interrupted his thoughts. "Dr. McGregor, they're ready for you." Jack turned, facing Colonel Graves, a hardened man in his late 40s, dressed in the dark uniform of the United Earth Defense. His expression was one Jack had grown accustomed to seeing on military faces, a mix of respect and doubt. Jack was a civilian, a scientist, and the idea that he'd be leading a team into enemy territory was hard for men like Graves to accept. Jack understood. He had trouble accepting it himself. "Let's get started," Jack said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling inside him. In the briefing room, Task Force Shadow was waiting, Earth's elite special forces, every one of them a master of combat and survival. Jack's eyes scanned the group. They were battle-hardened soldiers, and they looked at him as though he didn't belong. The leader, Captain Harris, stood at the front, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowing slightly as Jack entered the room. "All right, gentlemen," Colonel Graves began, nodding to Jack. "Dr. McGregor will explain the details of this mission." Jack stepped forward, tapping the screen that flickered to life behind him. A holographic map of the alien empire's territory hovered in the air, vast and intimidating. "We're calling this a surgical strike," Jack said, getting straight to the point. "The aliens are preparing a countermeasure to our dark matter technology. They've developed a facility where they're building a weapon that could nullify our advantage. If that happens, Earth will have no defense against their attack. Our mission is simple: infiltrate the facility, destroy their weapon, and get out alive." Captain Harris raised an eyebrow. "Simple, huh?" Jack ignored the sarcasm. "We'll be using dark matter to cloak our ship, making us invisible to their scanners. Once we're inside, we'll deploy a dark matter field that can shield us from their energy weapons." "Field tests are one thing," Harris said, leaning forward. "But how can we trust this technology to work under fire?" Jack met his gaze evenly. "Because if it doesn't, we're all dead." That silenced any further objections. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. The team moved with military precision, loading weapons, checking equipment, and running final simulations. Jack worked alongside them, checking the dark matter generators, ensuring they were calibrated perfectly. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. This was his technology, his mission. And if they failed, it would be on him. The shuttle lifted off without a sound, the dark matter cloak enveloping them in a bubble of silence and invisibility. Jack watched as the stars streaked by, the blackness of space wrapping around them like a blanket. The tension in the shuttle was thick. Captain Harris sat across from him, his rifle resting across his knees. The man hadn't spoken since the briefing. You ever been in combat, Doc? Harris asked suddenly, breaking the silence. No, Jack admitted. Harris smirked. Figured. Stick close, and don't do anything stupid. Jack's mouth tightened. He wasn't a soldier, but he wasn't helpless either. He would prove his worth soon enough. The alien empire's command facility loomed ahead, a massive structure pulsating with a sickly green light, like a hive of malevolence. Jack felt a chill crawl down his spine as the shuttle approached, but the dark matter cloak held. They slipped through the facility's outer defenses unnoticed, landing silently in a hangar bay. The team moved with practiced efficiency, sweeping the area for threats. Jack stayed close, his pulse quickening. This was real now, no more simulations, no more controlled tests. As they moved deeper into the facility, the alien architecture became more ominous. The walls seemed alive, throbbing with strange energy, and the air hummed with a low, vibrating sound. Jack tried not to let it distract him. He focused on the task at hand, planting the dark matter bombs in the facility's core. Suddenly, Harris raised a fist, signaling the team to stop. Jack froze, heart pounding. Up ahead, the shadows shifted, and a group of alien soldiers emerged. They were tall, insectoid creatures with sleek, armored bodies and glowing eyes. Their weapons crackled with energy. Harris whispered into his comm, "Prepare to engage." But Jack had another idea. "Wait," he whispered, activating the small device on his wrist. The dark matter generator hummed to life, and a shimmering field surrounded the team. The aliens continued forward, oblivious to the human standing just feet away, completely hidden by the dark matter cloak. Harris gave Jack a look of surprise but said nothing. They waited until the aliens passed, then moved silently toward the core. The facility's core was a sprawling chamber, dominated by a massive reactor, glowing with alien energy. Jack's heart raced as they approached. This was it, the point of no return. Once they planted the bombs, there would be no turning back. They moved quickly, placing the bombs around the reactor. Jack's hands trembled as he set the final charge, his mind racing with the implications of what they were about to do. If they succeeded, they would cripple the alien empire's ability to attack Earth. If they failed, suddenly, alarms blared. The dark matter field flickered and died, leaving them exposed. Alien soldiers poured into the chamber from all sides, weapons raised. Ambush. Harris shouted, opening fire. The room erupted into chaos. Jack ducked behind cover as energy blasts tore through the air. The soldiers fought with the precision of seasoned warriors, but the aliens were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Jack's mind raced. They were trapped. The bombs were set, but there was no way they could fight their way out in time. Then, it hit him. The dark matter. He activated the device on his wrist again, but this time, he pushed it to its limit. The field expanded, enveloping the entire chamber. The alien weapons sputtered and failed, their energy blasts dissipating harmlessly against the dark matter shield. Harris looked at Jack, stunned. "How long can you hold it?" "Not long," Jack gritted out, the strain evident in his voice. "Get the team out of here." Harris didn't argue. He barked orders, and the team began to retreat, fighting their way through the alien forces as Jack maintained the shield. His vision blurred, and his muscles screamed in protest, but he held on. This was his mission. His responsibility. Finally, the last of the team cleared the chamber. Jack stumbled, the dark matter field flickering. He glanced at the bombs. They were armed and ready to detonate. With a final burst of energy, Jack expanded the field one last time, creating a shield around the bombs as he ran for the exit. The aliens swarmed toward him, but their weapons were useless. Jack pushed through the pain, his body protesting every step. He reached the shuttle just as the facility began to shake, the bombs counting down their final seconds. Harris grabbed him, pulling him inside as the doors sealed shut. The shuttle rocketed away from the facility, and Jack collapsed into a seat, gasping for breath. Through the window, he watched as the alien command center exploded in a brilliant flash of light, the shockwave rippling through space. They had done it. The team sat in stunned silence as they watched the aftermath. Jack leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. The mission was a success, but the weight of what they had accomplished, and the lives lost, hung heavy in the air. Earth's blue and green orb appeared on the horizon. Harris clapped Jack on the shoulder, a rare smile crossing his face. "Not bad for a scientist." Jack managed a tired grin. "Thanks." But as the shuttle descended toward home, Jack's thoughts turned dark. Dark matter had saved them this time, but the technology was dangerous, unpredictable. And now, the entire galaxy knew what humanity was capable of. As the shuttle touched down at the base, the crew disembarked in silence. The adrenaline had long since drained from Jack's body, leaving him feeling hollow. He followed the soldiers through the hangar, their boots clanking against the metal floor, but his mind was elsewhere, still up in space, still back in that alien facility, watching the bombs detonate in a blaze of white-hot fury. Captain Harris and the rest of Task Force Shadow peeled off, heading for debriefing. Harris gave Jack a nod, something close to respect, though not quite, before disappearing into the corridor. Jack, for his part, barely noticed. His thoughts were thick and sluggish, his head pounding with exhaustion. The mission was over, yes, but there was no relief. Not yet. He needed answers. Inside the base's operations center, Colonel Graves stood waiting. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, scanned Jack as he approached. There was no handshake, no pleasantries, just the cold, businesslike air of a man who had seen too many wars. "McGregor," Graves said, his voice gruff. "You pulled it off. We weren't sure you'd make it back." Jack stopped, his legs aching from the strain of holding the dark matter field for so long. He swallowed hard before responding. "We got lucky. The aliens weren't expecting us, and the tech held up, barely." Graves tilted his head, narrowing his eyes. "Barely? It's unstable," Jack admitted. "The dark matter field worked, but it's unpredictable. We were this close to losing control. If I hadn't adjusted the parameters on the fly, we wouldn't have made it out." Graves nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "But it worked. You got the job done." Jack's jaw clenched. He wanted to believe it was that simple, but it wasn't. The technology they had developed was too powerful, too volatile. If it had fallen into the wrong hands, if the aliens had completed their own dark matter weapon, it could have meant the end of everything. And Jack wasn't sure that humanity was ready for what they had unlocked. "The mission was a success," Graves continued, his voice hard. "The alien empire's command network is in shambles. They won't be able to regroup for months, maybe years. You've given us time." "Time for what?" Jack asked, his voice sharper than he intended. He could feel the frustration rising, his heart thudding in his chest. "Time to do what, exactly? Build bigger weapons? Expand the war? You saw what that tech can do, Colonel. We can barely control it." Graves regarded him coolly. "We're at war, McGregor. You know that. The aliens won't stop, and we can't afford to either. This is about survival. Survival, Jack repeated, shaking his head. And what happens when that technology slips out of our control? When someone uses it without understanding the risks? Graves sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. That's not your call to make. Your job was to develop the tech and win the fight. You did that. Now leave the rest to us. Jack's mouth pressed into a thin line. He wanted to argue, to push back, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. The military wasn't interested in the moral implications of dark matter technology. They only cared about winning, about having the upper hand. And maybe that was the problem. Graves studied Jack for a moment, then nodded toward the exit. Get some rest, McGregor. You've earned it. Jack didn't respond. He turned on his heel and walked out, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Back in his quarters, Jack collapsed onto the bed, not bothering to undress. He stared up at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The victory, if that's what it was, felt hollow. He had seen too much, learned too much about the dark matter they had unleashed. The power they now wielded was dangerous, and the temptation to use it, to push it further, was too strong. For the first time since the project began, Jack felt real fear. Not for himself, but for what they had started. Days passed in a blur of debriefings, technical reports, and simulations. Jack moved through it all like a man in a fog, going through the motions but never fully engaged. He attended the mission's after-action review, nodded along as the generals praised Task Force Shadow for their bravery, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong, that they had set something in motion they wouldn't be able to stop. One evening, as Jack sat alone in the lab, reviewing the latest data from their dark matter experiments, the door slid open. He looked up, surprised to see Harris standing in the doorway, still in his combat gear. "Captain," Jack said, straightening in his chair. "What brings you down here?" Harris stepped inside, his face unreadable. "I've been thinking." Jack raised an eyebrow. "About?" "The mission," Harris said, his voice low. "About what we did, what we saw. That tech, it was something else." Jack nodded, feeling the familiar unease creep into his gut. "Yeah. It was." Harris took a step closer, his gaze fixed on the dark matter generator sitting on the workbench. "I'm no scientist, McGregor, but even I can tell when something's off. That field you used, it wasn't just tech. It was something more. Something alive." Jack froze, his blood running cold. He had sensed it too during the mission, the way the dark matter seemed to pulse, to react not just to commands but to intention, almost like it had a will of its own. "I don't know what we tapped into," Harris continued, his voice tight. "But I've seen a lot of weapons in my time, and this one, it scares me." Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. "You're not the only one." Harris nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Jack's. "So what are we going to do about it?" Jack stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing. He had always believed in science, in progress. But this was something different. Dark matter wasn't just a tool. It was something far more powerful, far more dangerous than anything humanity had ever encountered. "We need to stop," Jack said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to shut it down, before it's too late." Harris didn't argue. He just nodded. "Then let's do it." The plan was simple, but risky. Jack and Harris would sabotage the dark matter project from within, destroying the generators and wiping the research files before anyone could stop them. It was a bold move, one that could cost them everything, but Jack knew it was the only way to prevent the dark matter technology from falling into the wrong hands. Late that night, they moved through the base in silence, their footsteps muffled by the hum of machinery. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the lab, the weight of what they were about to do heavy on his shoulders. Inside, the dark matter generator pulsed softly, the blue glow casting eerie shadows across the room. Jack hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the control panel. This was it. Once they did this, there would be no going back. "You sure about this?" Harris asked quietly. Jack took a deep breath, his mind flashing back to the mission, to the way the dark matter had seemed to come alive in his hands. He couldn't let that happen again. Not here. Not anywhere. "Yeah," Jack said, his voice steady. "I'm sure." He typed in the command, his fingers moving quickly over the keys. The generator hummed louder, then began to whine as the shutdown sequence activated. Alarms blared, red lights flashing overhead. They didn't have much time. Harris moved to the storage units, pulling out the hard drives containing the research data. He smashed them against the floor, the sound of shattering metal and plastic echoing through the lab. Jack worked frantically, disabling the final systems, his hands shaking with the adrenaline. Just as the generator's hum died to a low whine, the door to the lab burst open. Colonel Graves stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 armed guards. "McGregor," Graves barked, his face twisted in fury. "What the hell are you doing?" Jack straightened, his heart racing. "We're shutting it down, Colonel. This technology, it's too dangerous. You know it." Graves' eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. "You're making a mistake. You don't get to make this call." "I already did," Jack said, his voice firm. And so did Harris. The guards raised their weapons, but Graves held up a hand, stopping them. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Jack's. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Graves exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "You're a damn fool, McGregor." "Maybe," Jack said. "But I'm not wrong." The generator powered down with a final hiss, the blue glow fading into darkness. The lab fell silent, save for the distant hum of the base's systems. It was over. For now, Graves turned on his heel, storming out of the lab without another word. The guards hesitated, then followed him, leaving Jack and Harris alone in the darkened room. Harris let out a low breath, shaking his head. "Well, that was close." Jack nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. They had stopped the dark matter project for now, but he knew it wouldn't be the last time they faced this kind of threat. The universe was vast, and there were always more dangers lurking in the shadows. As they left the lab, Jack glanced back at the darkened generator one last time. He had done the right thing, he was sure of it, but the unease lingered, gnawing at him. The war wasn't over. Not by a long shot.